The history of the human race is fraught with countless battles, endless suffering, and the specters of conflicts throughout centuries. We are a species who fight for land, for profit, for protection. We send our sons and daughters to become meat to the grinder, to become the future specters that relive their darkest moments in a terrifying loop on their old battlefields. Today, I have 5 allegedly real Army ghost stories that tie the supernatural with historical turning points. Be sure to like this video and subscribe for more creepy tales. I was a recruit in the training phase of national service back then. My platoon has a lot of recruits who are falling sick or getting injured regularly. My bunk is especially guilty of that because it is all too common to see my bunkmates disappear in the middle of the night, only to see them return from the medical office in the middle of the night. During the month of August, there is something we call the Hungry Ghost Festival. During this period, supernatural activity becomes quite common. It was around this time that I saw something for myself that I could not explain. One day in the middle of the night at around 3 a.m., I was awakened by the sounds of someone dragging their boots on the ground, followed by the sound of someone groaning in pain. I was annoyed as I poked my head up to see who was making that noise. What I saw was a soldier in full uniform with his army cap on, limping across the room with a bandaged left leg and his arm in a sling. I thought that another of my bunkmates had returned from the medical office once again, so I turned over and tried to get some sleep. But this limping man stopped in the middle of my room and stood over a bed where no one slept. The groaning sound continued for an hour as he stared at the bed. It ruined my sleep, and I was beginning to get pissed off. The following day, I asked my bunkmates who made all that noise, but no one admitted to it. Rather, they looked confused and a little scared. When I mentioned the unused bed, we all realized that something wasn't right. There are 8 double-deckered beds in the bunk, 16 beds in total. The only bed that was not in use was the one on the right side in the middle of the room. No one ever explained why, but we were always just told to avoid sleeping in that bed. On the very same day I told them about the limping ghost, 2 of my bunkmates ended up sleeping in that bed. It was a bit of an experiment to see what would happen. I wasn't personally afraid of the ghost, but I ended up making others feel afraid, I guess. Nothing happened to the bunkmates who slept there so far, that is. To me, personally, ghosts are like an annoying neighbor. Leave them alone and they'll leave you be. If you catch their interest, though, they'll approach you. Ghost sightings aren't always scary or good. Sometimes they remain neutral. 1988, I was born and raised in the South, in a very historic location that was a major battle site during the Civil War called Vicksburg, Mississippi. My town is known for ghostly sightings, as many people died here in battle or due to the Union blockade of the Mississippi River. While I personally have never seen a ghost myself, I have felt their presence. One famous place to go in Vicksburg is the McRaven House, which is ranked among the 100 most haunted places in America. I'd never been there before, even though I'd lived here for my entire life, but the paranormal had always intrigued me. So one day, my best friend Ray and I decided to pay for a tour of the house. I'd like to say here that I felt perfectly fine before Ray and I entered that house, but as the tour progressed, I began to feel sicker and sicker. With each room we passed through, I began to lean against Ray more and more for support and comfort. I was beginning to feel short of breath and ready to pass out. We went up a flight of stairs which led to a small hallway where some personal items from the Civil War era were stored. I listened as best I could as the lady conducting the tour pointed to things and explained a little bit about them. She showed us a small carriage made for a little girl's doll, and explained how they would put it up at night, only to find it in another room entirely the next morning. Then she pointed out an old medical stretcher. It still had the bloodstains on it, from when McRaven was used as a makeshift medical hospital during the Civil War. Then she told us of a story about a little boy who had passed out on the spot directly where my friend was during a previous tour. By that point, I could barely stand up on my own. I was putting most of my weight on Ray, so I could imagine how that little boy must have felt. I knew I had to get out of that house, although I felt bad about not being able to finish the tour. I told Ray that we had to go, because honestly, I felt like if I stayed there any longer, I was going to vomit. She could see that something was really wrong with me, so she hastily helped me out of the house and back to my car. I sat in the car for about 5 minutes before I slowly began to feel better. 10 more minutes later and my symptoms were gone entirely. I no longer felt sick to my stomach and I could breathe just fine. Although I never saw anything, something sinister was definitely affecting my body that day. That was unlike any sickness or nausea I'd ever felt, and I will never go back in that house. But that is not the only creepy thing to happen to me. In Vicksburg, there is also a relatively large military park full of Civil War monuments and many unmarked graves of both Union and Confederate soldiers. At the time of this second incident, I was working at a local Chinese restaurant. I usually worked the night shift and would get off work around 10, then head home. The route I would take to my house passed directly by the military park, as it was the fastest way home. One night, while driving home, I was on the phone with my mother when my phone suddenly dropped the call. At first, this didn't bother me too much, as the area I was passing by had a lot of hills and very little, if any, cell phone service, so I knew the phone would probably drop the call sometime. However, instead of hearing silence on my way there, I heard something else, someone else. It sounded like several garbled voices, speaking all at once, but I could not understand what they were saying. It didn't sound human, really, but it didn't sound mechanical either. I had no idea what I was hearing. It freaked me out, so I decided to cut my phone off completely, thinking that that would make it stop. But even with my phone shut off, the voices grew louder. All of this happened as I was driving by the unmarked graves of the military park that you could see from the road to my house. I told my grandparents about what happened. My grandmother laughed at me, saying jokingly that it may have been aliens. But my grandfather, on the other hand, looked serious and said that because we have Native American blood flowing through our veins, he believes we are more connected to the spiritual world, and that what I heard was the mumbling sound of the voices of those who died in the Civil War. This didn't make me feel any better. I began to take a different route after that experience. I'm from a little village in the south of Ireland. My whole life, I've experienced paranormal activity. This may be because my house was a former army barracks. I was 14 years old. Each night as I would go to bed, I would hear someone talking in my ear. One night, I even began to feel someone rubbing my earlobe. I could feel a cold finger run down my ear. I remember lying in bed being forced down. I felt a presence holding me down. I was semi-asleep, so I jolted up screaming, only to hear a demonic-like voice scream at me. Deep down, I felt like something was trying to take my body, but I would not let it in. Since that day, things have never been the same. In this particular story, it began with the passing of a close friend of mine. I was much more distressed than usual because of this. Well, my partner at the time and I were watching a movie, Paranormal Activity, I believe. This gave him the idea to taunt spirits in the house, in a playful way, of course, not expecting anything to happen. We eventually finished the movie. We were making our way to go to sleep. I think it was around 1 a.m. at the time, so it was pretty late. All of a sudden, the landline phone began to beep. We began to search for the phone and eventually found it outside on the landing, which was odd because we never used the phone out there, nor would we ever leave it out there like that. It was just lying there in the middle of the floor. This creeped me out pretty bad, especially after my partner told me that he hadn't done it. We put the phone back on the base, then headed to bed. No sooner had I put my head on the pillow. The smoke alarm began to beep the way it would when you pressed the test button on it. However, it was 15 feet from the floor to the ceiling where it was, and you had to have a ladder to press that button. At this point, the two of us were freaking out. After a while, with things being quiet again, we once more tried to go to sleep. Maybe if anything, I told myself it was just a spirit trying to say hello to us. Nothing negative. Now beside our bed was a window and a blind. It's the type of blind that could be opened by a heavy cord. As we were laying there, eyes closed in the bed in the dark, the blind suddenly pulled itself up violently and shaked without anyone touching it, almost tearing itself apart. It shook so hard. The window wasn't open, so it was not the wind. I was screaming and crying. I had never been so surprised or scared my entire life. I couldn't get to sleep that night, and I never joked around or messed with spirits again. We later moved out of that house, thank God. The spirit world is no joke. It exists, and it can often be just as tangible as the things sitting in front of you. So be careful if you ever decide to taunt the things you can't see. Something I could not explain from Alan Oman. My days in the sandbox were fun and a nightmare itself that haunts me daily and takes a part of my soul with it. It was around the end of my tour of duty. My platoon and I were pure with an Abrams team of 6. We were on our way to support a Pines platoon who had been trapped for 2 days with heavy casualties. We passed through a village that was suspiciously empty. That's when the worst happened. It must have been an RPG. The tank in front of us exploded, and on that tank was my closest friend at the time. Ducking, I ran over to the remains. I found the rest of my friend, who then perished in my arms. It was a firefight after that. I stayed next to the body of my friend as we were pinned down by enemy fire. I didn't want to leave him. I had to bring him back so we could put him to rest properly. I was sitting with my shoulder against a large piece of debris. I wasn't facing the direction of my friend's body, but the next time I did look over, I jumped. There was someone standing there, not in uniform at all. Rather, it was an immaculate, perfectly clean little girl. She had this blank expression on her face as she stared down at my friend. I watched as she bent down and placed her palm over his cheek, smearing blood and dirt over his skin. Still in shock, I think, I yelled at her, "What do you think you're doing?" She then turned her head to look at me. The moment her pupils met mine, goosebumps covered my body and my heart pounded. There was something wrong about this girl. She stood back up and took a few steps toward me, still with that blank expression on her face. I remember feeling a deep and palpable dread well up inside me. I couldn't explain it. Why was I so absolutely horrified by this little girl? The fear was so bad I began to crawl backward, completely exposing my upper half to the enemy. I was lucky that I was not shot. The girl suddenly stopped, shook her head, and disappeared before my very eyes. It was like she never existed. I got back behind cover and looked at the dirt. She hadn't left any footprints, despite the dirt being dry and completely movable. It didn't make any sense, not mentally, not physically. Who was she? Why did she visit my friend and I? I began to pray right then and right there, prayed desperately in tears for the safety of my men and for the soul of my perished friend. In the next 2 hours, we would be rescued and transported by helicopter back to a U.S. base. We made it out alive, well, not all of us. Having taken a bullet wound to the shoulder, I was sent back home, and I was able to attend my friend's funeral. I ended up telling my friend's family some time after that about the little girl, hoping that it was someone he knew in the past or someone related to him that perished too early. But no, the girl did not ring any bells among his family. Was she an angel? Was she a demon? Or was it something else? I guess I'll never know, but maybe, just maybe, I'll see her again. This happened to me when I was 10 years old. I was living in a market town in mid-Wales when this occurred. To give a bit of backstory, I had been living in mid-Wales since 2001, but I moved back to England in 2011. So 10 years was how long I lived there. This market town was between Welshpool and Barmouth. I was with the cadets in Wales, and in 2007 there was a trip in Portsmouth, which is the only island city in the United Kingdom. I was at an encampment which was around 20 miles from Portsmouth, where I, along with the other cadets, were put in dorms. There were about 10 of us in these 2-story buildings. My bed was a camp bed with a little metal cabinet and a small but very old side table, and then there was the other 2 cadets either side of me. I did the usual exercises you do as an Army cadet. For example, we did a full 2-hour march and stand at attention exercise, while afterwards we grabbed our lunch from this very small and run-down hut, which was mostly always overcrowded, and you were only allowed to eat around the area of the hut. This annoyed me because I preferred to keep to myself, especially when I ate. Now here is where things got strange. I was out in the woods with some cadets, and our assigned drill sergeant was with us. We were told to learn about cover and hide, which is sort of the equivalent of being taught how to set up an ambush, where you either hide or find appropriate cover. I was briefly lost after everyone split up. I found cover, and while I was in hiding, I heard twigs snapping around me. I thought that it was one of the other cadets on my team, or maybe the opponents we were to ambush. When I looked up slowly, trying not to be heard, I didn't see anyone at all. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was some animal. We were in a very rural area, so wildlife was common. Even so, I began to hear the footsteps drawing closer to my position, yet no one was there every time I checked. This was early afternoon with the sun high in the sky. I had clear visibility, but I could not ascertain where the footsteps were coming from. I was beginning to freak out, and made as best as I could a stealth run back to where the place of meeting was, only to ruin the activity for everyone. The other cadets were of course annoyed at me. I told the assigned drill sergeant about what happened, but he seemed annoyed at me too, and said that it was just my imagination. Maybe he was right. A 10-year-old could have an overactive imagination. We were then told we were setting up camp for the night, and unlike my usual self, I was a bit more comfortable than knowing people were around. Having been so creeped out, I didn't want to be alone. I was told who I would be camping with. They were these two boys in other cadet units. That night we were being given a lesson on the way the Army sets up camps in the woods when they're in the middle of a battlefield, and for recon too. I happened to glance off into the distance during this. The forest, including the grass under it, was quite clear under the dim moonlight. It was beautiful, like something from a painting. I wasn't paying attention to the seminar, hardly listening to what the lieutenant was saying. That was when I saw the outline of a shadowy figure walking across the grass, from one side of the forest to the other side. I thought it was probably a reflection of the trees and the moon, but as I focused, it was very clearly the silhouette of a man. He looked towards me, and in a kind of in-the-mind voice, I heard it. "When you die, you'll burn in hell." I was trembling and scared. Then one of the sergeants looked at me and saw me freaking out. She came over and asked me if I was okay. Now I was quite a sensitive child, and I got upset very easily. Out of the sight of the other cadets, I was in the back of a parked minibus, weeping my eyes out. I was overcome with emotion and fear. I was able to sit out the lessons and speak to my dad. He told me I was being overreactive and to calm down, but I couldn't. I then told him I wanted to go home, but I had missed my chance to when another friend of mine went home with his mom 2 days prior into the 11-day stay. 2 days after this, there was a party going on in the hall of the complex. I was there for a couple of hours, as it was not really a disco party with a DJ and a bar, just a drink stand and a CD player hooked up to speakers, playing the recent albums that had come out here. I was heading back alone to the dorms. My dorm was on the other side of the complex, and I knew I had quite the walk ahead of me. As I headed back towards my dorm, I saw a woman in a cadet uniform looking away from me, near the girls-only dorms. I asked her if she was all right, or if she was lost, to which she replied in an echoey voice, "You shouldn't be here." And then I saw it. The bottom half of her body was transparent. I freaked out, making a mad run back to the door, pounding at it, slapping my hands against the windows until another cadet who I spoke to let me in. I went straight to the dorm that I was staying in, and I did not leave for the rest of the night, nor did I sleep a wink. It was the 10th day in, and the final night before I could go back to Mid-Wales. I was so relieved, and decided to make this day count, as it was my last day. That day was fairly relaxed. It consisted of a reward ceremony and a rafting trip, including canoeing and rock climbing. The day flew by, and it was almost night. I went back to my dorm feeling happy. It was the last night, so one of the rooms on the other end of the building from our dorm decided they would host a Ouija board session. They invited me along, which I kindly declined and went to sleep. Over 2 hours later, after falling asleep, I woke up to a noise of footsteps on the wooden floor and the sound of tapping on the walls, which I thought was the other dorm being in a wind-up mood, as they had shockingly shared a spliff amongst each other, although they were between 12 and 14 at the time. I guess it wasn't really a surprise. I got up to check outside the door, only to see the door closed. I lowered my head and tried to go back to sleep. Another 30 minutes later, the noises started up again, only this time it was in the dorm that I was sleeping in. I thought that it was one of the cadets, but apart from me and two other cadets who were asleep, the beds were vacant and no one was moving around. I went back to sleep again, and once more, not long after that, the room grew cold. I mean freezing cold, and I woke up. I was beginning to feel scared. I had to remind myself that the windows were locked and could only be opened with a key. I looked up at the door after feeling like my legs were frozen, and I saw it. Somehow someone was in the room. In the right corner of the ajar door was the upper half of a man looking in on us, with nothing but the shape of his upper torso and his head. He looked at me, and I whispered over to the other cadet next to me to see if he saw him too. But like the other ones before, he ignored me, saying that I was just seeing things. I couldn't help but think that the other dorm messing with that Ouija board may have made things worse. The entity just stared in at me and then vanished into the darkness. I did not sleep for the rest of the night after that, and finally I knew it was time to go home. All the cadets said goodbye to one another, including a few who tried to photograph me, but I hated having my picture taken. So when it was all said and done, the coach left Portsmouth, and I went back home. Looking back at those 11 days in that encampment, I can only think of one thing from that time. Why was I told that I would burn in hell? What was the meaning behind those occurrences? Why was I the only one who saw and heard everything that happened? Maybe they knew it was haunted and wanted to keep it hidden, or maybe I was the chosen participant in these spirits' game. Nothing has happened since, but those 11 days were the days that hell came to me. Violence in this world is impossible to avoid. People will always fight over something. There's good in this world, bad in this world, and there's always someone in between. And as long as there is a difference of opinion, there will be war. And with war comes death. And of course, with death often comes an avoidance of the afterlife, as spirits make their way back to haunt the living, for whatever reason they may have. So the next time you're looking at a historical battlefield monument and you see something you can't explain, don't be surprised. With how many people perished there, I'd be surprised if there weren't hundreds of ghosts lurking around at any moment. Good night. Here's to us never having to go to war ourselves. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed it.